This week, we launch our own podcast. You can listen to it through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. We'll be covering stories from around the world, similar to those you see on this program, but we'll get a bit more personal and candid with our guests and correspondents. So if you're on the go, whether on the train, driving to work, or just out for a run, give us a listen and make sure to subscribe. Search online for CGTN and the Heat Podcast. 1 year after the United States abandoned the nuclear deal with Iran, Tehran is pushing back against Donald Trump's calls to restart talks. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. In recent weeks, tensions between the United States and Iran have escalated, raising concerns the two countries could be headed toward a possible war. But in a sudden shift, U.S. President Donald Trump announced he's not interested in pursuing regime change and is ready to negotiate a new nuclear deal with the Iranian leadership. The White House position does not change the fact that the U.S. president has tightened economic sanctions on Iran, ordered 1,500 additional troops to the Middle East, and sent an aircraft carrier to the region. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani says Tehran is willing to talk with the United States if it's in a respectful manner. But Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, defended his country's nuclear ambitions and said Tehran would never heed to American pressure.
We can see in the defense and military arena we have reached a point of being able to deter our enemies. And the fact that they insist on curtailing our missile program is because of this. They want to deprive us of this capability, and of course they will never succeed.
For more on US-Iran tensions, let's bring in our panel. Joining us now from Lavasan in Tehran province, Iran, via Skype is Nasser Hadian. He's a professor of law and political science at the University of Tehran. Here with us in Washington, D.C. is Negar Mortazavi. She's a journalist and consultant editor with the British online newspaper The Independent. From Brussels, Guy Burton is a visiting fellow with the London School of Economics Middle East Centre. And James Carafano is vice president of the Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy and the E.W. Richardson Fellow at the Heritage Foundation right here in Washington, D.C. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Let's start in Tehran with Nasser. And Nasser, the United States, of course, has abandoned the nuclear deal with Iran. It's violated that deal, also known as the JCPOA. But now, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, he's now offering talks without preconditions. This is what the Secretary had to say. Let's watch.
We're prepared to engage in a conversation with no preconditions. We're ready to sit down with them. But the American effort to fundamentally reverse the malign activity of this Islamic Republic, this revolutionary force, is going to continue.
So, Nasser, Iran has dismissed that offer. It calls it wordplay. What is the Iranian government's position on talks with the United States?
I guess basically, as you correctly mentioned, Iran perceived that this is just a playing with words. There is not a change in a strategy or in tactic. Rather, they think that, okay, now possibly it's a better idea to offer basically a talk, unconditional talk, which can satisfy possibly the European and also some domestic constituency in Iran that, okay, U.S. is not just a hawkish word, but rather it's offering also an unconditional talk. So that's the perception in Tehran, that this is not serious. And if they want to show any sign of seriousness, they have to go back first to the JCPOA. Then there is a sense of plausibility of the argument. Otherwise, without that, they think it's just a different tactics.
But Nasser, isn't that then Iran putting conditions on talks?
Yes, I mean, this is like, I will not be surprised personally. Will not be surprised to see that Iran, after 4 months, basically doing a number of things which is sort of violation of the JCPOA, and then Iran also offer an unconditional talk. In other words, they would wait for at least, in the best scenario would be 2 months from now, Iran would begin Iraq reactor to work on the Arak reactor, and also would increase the level of the enrichment to 20%. Then Iran would offer also unconditional talk.
All right, Negar, the U.S. National Security Advisor, John Bolton, recently accused Tehran of being behind an alleged attack on 4 oil tankers in the Gulf. Iran denied that it was involved, and Bolton didn't provide any kind of evidence for his allegations. What do you make of that? Was this an attempt by Bolton to build up some kind of a case for action against Iran?
Well, I don't know what John Bolton's evidence is. We're still waiting to see. I can't completely deny it, but from the history of what John Bolton's goal has been in the past few years before even President Trump got to the White House, John Bolton has been on the record saying the regime in Iran has to change. He even said he would celebrate a different regime in Iran in 2019, which didn't happen. He's written in 2015 that Iran has to be bombed, its nuclear sites, and basically he's been a pro-war, pro-pressure voice on Iran in the past years. Since joining the Trump administration, though, it seems like John Bolton's rhetoric has changed to some extent. And recently, along the same time of those incidents, John Bolton, on the record, said that the U.S. is not after regime change in Iran. Now, it seems like the president, John Bolton, and Mike Pompeo are all saying the same thing. We're not after regime change. And now with the recent statement from the Secretary of State that they're ready to do talks without preconditions, it seems like everyone's getting in line with the ultimate goal of President Trump, which is negotiations and a new deal with Iran.
James, is that a problem, the mixed message that's coming out of the White House? On the one hand, the United States says it's prepared for talks without any preconditions, but just this morning, Wednesday morning, in London, President Trump told a British television network that there is a chance of military action against Iran. He also said he'd rather talk than take military action against Iran. But what are we to make of those statements?
Well, you know, there's rhetoric and there's action. I found with this administration, the most important thing is to actually look what the policy is and what the actions that they actually take. And the U.S. has actually been very consistent on its Iran policy with what it actually laid out in the national security strategy. And so it was from the beginning, I think you're correct, it was never about regime change. It was from the beginning is putting pressure on Iran to deal with the United States sees as destabilizing activity in the region. And then the long game would be that at some point that if Iran chose to relieve that pressure, it would do that by coming back in the table and doing a deal with the United States that the U.S. felt acceptable.
Could the United States, James, have not built on the JCPOA rather than pulling out of it?
Well, I think the short answer is no. I think they demonstrated a willingness to try that in negotiating with their European partners, but that would have required, one, that they all agree on what could be done to strengthen the JCPOA, and that would have led to step 2, which is, would the Iranians have agreed to that? And so I think they tried that first trajectory, and they felt it was going nowhere, and since they felt that the JCPOA was inadequate to safeguard U.S. interests and concerns, that the answer was to withdraw from the JCPOA. So technically, well, not technically, I mean, they didn't violate the JCPOA. The JCPOA was an agreement of willing partners. The U.S. withdrew from the agreement, so it's not violating an agreement because it's not part of the agreement.
Yes, it was signed by President Obama. It
doesn't matter.
It was not ratified in Congress.
Right, so it's not a binding treaty. It's a voluntary agreement that any party can withdraw from whenever they want.
Right, but it was from the Iranian viewpoint, it's considered a violation because the Iranians, to this day, are still abiding by their end of the commitment, and the United States just pulled out unilaterally at the opposition, even its European partners, and then imposed sanctions, which is now, we have to remember, the precondition Iran is setting, the lifting of sanctions, was actually part of the JCPOA before President Trump violated it. Yeah.
Right. All right, let's go to Guy in Berlin. And Guy, European companies have pulled out of Iran while their government signatories to this agreement are trying to save this deal. Iran has complained that European signatories have not stuck to the deal. So is Europe basically at the mercy of what the White House decides here?
Well, the Europeans have been trying to set up this mechanism where they can go bypass the financial institutions and banks that might be vulnerable to sanctions. I mean, they started talking about this time last year when the Americans withdrew from the JCPOA, but it's taken until now for that to actually be in the process of being implemented. And I think it's somewhat frustrating for the Iranians because it really only deals with a small basket of goods at the moment. It doesn't include things like oil and gas. And so it's going to take a bit of time for it to actually sort of get up and running. But certainly that, I think, from the Iranian point of view, is a source of frustration. On the other hand, the Europeans are obviously trying to sort of balance this, and they've been consistently saying over the last couple of months, and especially since the withdrawal of America from the JCPOA, that they want restraint, they want dialogue, they want engagement. So I think it's been quite interesting to sort of see the two sides of American rhetoric here. On the one side, about a month ago, with people like John Bolton being quite forthright, and then on the other hand, Pompeo trying to sort of say we can go for negotiations. Certainly that's what the Europeans want to see.
Nasser, for the time being, Iran is playing hardball, especially the response to Mike Pompeo's offer of unconditional talks. But if you look at what's going on in Iran right now, its currency has lost 60% of its value. The prices of staple foods in the country is skyrocketing. You look at medicines, which people need in Iran. That's hard to find, very expensive. How much pressure can Iran withstand?
I guess still we have enough resources to handle the situation, and I guess Iran can easily withstand the pressure for another couple of years. And but certainly Iran would increase the heat. It is not going to be done like last year because Iran gave enough time to the US, gave enough time to the Europe to basically abide by the promises, to fulfill their promises, but it did not happen. Thus, Iran certainly is going to increase the pressure. In other words, to me, Iran is going to deploy forces, huge unit of the Revolutionary Guard and the army in the Persian Gulf coasts, all along from the Strait of Hormuz all the way up to the north and north of the Persian Gulf, and they would be prepared basically for any sorts of eventuality. That's my prediction. And they think that if you listen to Ayatollah Khamenei's talk last night, basically Iran is preparing itself for what they call a resistance. And resistance, not only in military terms, but economy and the other, and socially as well. They need it.
Yeah. Just one point on that, Nasser. I mean, can Iran afford to do this?
Of course. You will see it's going to happen. It's going to happen within the next couple of months. Iran is not going to close down the Strait of Hormuz. Yeah. Certainly, that's not in the plan.
Yeah.
But what Iran would do, in fact, it's going to create problems for the only oil tankers.
Yeah. James, if Iran does that, how does the United States respond?
Well, I think the United States would see keeping the Straits of Hormuz open as its vital interest, much like it did under Ronald Reagan, and certainly has the military capacity and the resources to do that. I agree with that assessment. This is a very centralized society. They've proven quite resilient in the Iran-Iraq war and sanctions before. I have no doubt that they can continue to endure that. I think the Hobbesian choice for Iran is if they choose to demonstrate that resistance aggressively, offensively, the likelihood of that is more Europeans, more Middle East will tend towards supporting America in the pressure campaign against Iran. On the other hand, if they just want to tough it out, and wait for a different American president or a dramatic geopolitical shift that creates a new opening for them, I think they can probably do that.
And Negar, doesn't that increase the chances of there being some kind of confrontation? All you need is a miscalculation if Iran's going to adopt a very aggressive position in the Gulf. A miscalculation, some spark that sets off a wider violence.
I think so. I mean, I still have to reiterate that both leaderships, like so far we know that the supreme leader in Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, doesn't seem to want a conflict, and President Trump doesn't want a conflict. Even his top advisors have been now on the record saying they don't want a conflict. But the way the military posture in the region and everything is set up could very well lead into an accident, and also if negotiations don't get anywhere, it seems like there's some openings, there's this dance or this game from both sides. President Trump is saying without preconditions, and the Iranian president somehow responded to that, saying lift the sanctions and then we can start the negotiations. I think the Iranians have understood, or at least the Rouhani camp, that there's no way you can bring President Trump back to the Iran deal. He's not going to re-sign or re-enter the JCPOA, but there might be other ways of putting that in front of him. For example, just calling it a lifting of sanctions, which is what the Iranians care about. They don't, the persistence of the U.S. in the JCPOA is not the big issue. The lifting of sanctions is the big issue. And I think they can resist and wait for another 2 years, but it's not guaranteed that President Trump is going anywhere. He might very well be the next president. And then within the next 2 years, the pressure is all going to be on the Iranian population, on ordinary Iranians who are already under a lot of pressure. The economy has been on a downfall, and it's just going to get worse. It's not impossible to resist, but it's going to be very difficult for the citizens.
And even if President Trump does lose the next election, there's still 18 months to go. They're going to be under pressure for 18 months. Guy Burton, how much concern is there in Europe over these developments in the Gulf? I mean, we see these additional troops, U.S. troops being sent to the region, aircraft carrier being deployed, more warplanes. And I think I should clarify something. John Bolton did say that this was in response to threats from Iran, but the deployment of these troops and the aircraft carrier was planned actually a month before. It was part of a regular deployment in the Gulf. But still, how much concern is there in Europe that this could turn into something worse?
Well, I mean, can I just say that having listened to your other guests talking about the possibility of confrontation, I mean, if it's going to happen, it's somewhat unlikely that it's going to be conventional. I would imagine it to be much more of a sort of clandestine, sort of asymmetric approach. And if you think about, you know, what's been happening in the last couple of months, what with the sort of the tankers having been hit, and we still don't know who's claimed responsibility for those, the pipelines that the Houthis claimed that responsibility in Saudi Arabia for hitting. Those, I think, are going to be the sort of the type of confrontation that we're going to see. It's going to be indirect, and certainly I think from, you know, if we think about it from the American perspective, in a way, sort of the sanctions, although we're talking about this directly, I mean, it has had an impact on other aspects, including the Iranians' ability to help provide finance to Hezbollah. So, you know, for that, I think we can sort of say that the possibility of sort of direct confrontation in the form of a conventional war seems somewhat unlikely. But that said, I mean, certainly from the European perspective, there is concern about the rhetoric being directed on both sides, and also with the Iranians talking about increasing their stockpile of enriched uranium and heavy water. This is something that the Europeans pushed back on when Iran said last month that they were going to do this, and they said no, you should continue to maintain the JCPOA. So certainly any sort of efforts to try and sort of, you know, downplay and dampen down sort of the tensions that are present would be welcome here.
Nasser, how does Iran see these deployments in the Gulf? I mean, we've heard some very confident statements from Iranian leaders saying that they do not believe that they're going to be attacked by the United States. But in any case, would Iran be prepared for something like that?
Of course, as I said, that Iran is preparing itself for that eventuality. No doubt about it. You know, no one is under any illusion. That is, I mean, unless we deploy forces, and be prepared for such a kind of a fight, no matter the cost. So the strategic calculus in Washington will not be changed, particularly for President Trump. So because what President Rouhani did here, what Secretary Zarif did here, Foreign Minister Zarif did here, they think they were wrong. Of course, some of the hardliners would go all the way to call them they committed treason. And they think that unless we change the posture, unless we show that we are really for the fight, that would not change the strategic calculus in Washington. So that's why you will see within a few months, Iran is going to deploy far greater forces in the Persian Gulf to show that Iran is ready for a fight, conventional and asymmetric both. And the deployment of U.S. forces would be welcome, basically, because that would automatically lead to the increase of the oil prices. And the assumption in Tehran, or the perception is, if there is only one aircraft carrier in the region, that would not change significantly the price of oil. But if it is a 3-4 aircraft carrier within the vicinity of the Persian Gulf, then the chances for increasing of the oil prices would be much higher. Thus, in that regard, they will be welcome. Yes.
Is that something that the United States factors in, the price of oil?
Well, I think the whole world factors in the price of oil, but again, completely agree with their assessment. That's why I think it's incredibly. I mean, and you know, I was in the military for 25 years before I started doing think tanks. If you look at the footprint that's been deployed in the Gulf, it can do a range of things, which is why it would send. So it can do everything from kind of evacuating non-combatants to up to maybe a punitive strike. It can't conduct a sustained campaign. It certainly can't threaten the security of Iran. I mean, it's very clear from the footprints that there. To do that, you'd have to have a much larger force. So if Iran deployed more conventional capability on its frontiers, I think the response from the United States would be, okay. But certainly the United States wouldn't match deployments, you know, troop for troop. That would make no sense, and there would be no strategic reason for the United States to do that. It's incredibly unlikely. Yeah,
and the other point is that aircraft carrier has been deployed, but it has not entered the Gulf.
Right, and the point is you don't have to put an American carrier in the Gulf because all that's within the operating sphere of what the U.S. And both sides know this. I mean, the Iranians are very sophisticated in understanding what U.S. military capabilities are. And so when the United States do things, they do it with the full knowledge that whatever the rhetoric is, the Iranians understand what the capabilities that are being brought in the region and what they can and can't do.
And one more point that I wish to add is, of course, as I mentioned, I think both Iran and US, they don't want war. Iran is going to deploy forces in order to deter, in order to show the resolution, the resolve of the people that they are ready for the fight, but they don't want to fight unless they have to.
Negar, what is your view on that? You know, you talked earlier on about the mixed messages coming out of Washington. John Bolton expressing a desire in the past for some kind of regime change. Actually, President Trump addressed that, and this is what he had to say. Let's watch this.
I think Iran has tremendous economic potential, and I look forward to letting them get back to the stage where they can show that. I think Iran, I know so many people from Iran. These are great people. It has a chance to be a great country with the same leadership. We're not looking for regime change. I just want to make that clear. We're looking for no nuclear weapons.
Says the president they're walking back the rhetoric of his national security advisor.
I definitely think so. I think the strategy of President Trump, if I can call it a strategy, or his goal from day one, like I said, was to bring them to the table and get a deal. And he's trying to use the same blueprint on North Korea. Pressure, threaten, rhetoric, and then at the end of the day, sending love letters and then doing the photo op and the summit with the leader. Now, the Iranian leadership has a very different way of thinking and seeing this issue. They're not looking for photo ops with President Trump. They're not looking for that kind of legitimacy on the world stage with the American president. But I think President Trump has understood this, and he's understood that, I guess, that you need a stick and you need a carrot. And I feel like he's in his carrot mode. This is the carrot mode to provide to the Iranians that we don't want regime change. The same leadership can stay in position, which is very important from the Iranian viewpoint. And also, we don't have any condition except for nuclear weapons, which was what the JCPOA was made for. But I want to add that this is a crisis of President Trump's making, because he could have stayed in the JCPOA, continue using that diplomatic process with the Europeans to come up with more negotiations and more deals with Iran. Instead, he pulled out. He imposed sanctions, and he did this military posture in the region, which of course the Iranians are going to respond to for, as Professor Hadian is saying, for deterrence, but that could very well lead to some kind of maybe unconventional or proxy conflict also.
Right. Guy, last May, just this past month actually, Iran gave the European Union a 60-day ultimatum. President Rouhani said that Iran would stop abiding by parts of the nuclear agreement and resume the production of enriched uranium if Europe doesn't deliver on trade. What's Europe's response to that?
Well, as I said previously, the Europeans have responded by saying that they want to see dialogue engagement and partnership. And that's not just with regard to the Americans, it's also with regard to the Iranians. So they want the Iranians to continue to keep to the JCPOA. They see this as detrimental because this, in effect, even though they've started the process of building up their stockpiles, it will take a bit of time before they breach them, and then that creates problems for where next. Now, you might see this as the Iranians trying to put pressure on Europe. Europeans are an important trading partner to Iran. Back last year, the Europeans counted, or the EU 28 counted for around 20% of trade with Iran, which puts them in second place after China. So they are an important component that in terms of sort of an economic solution. But that said, the Europeans themselves don't necessarily want to see the Iranians pursue what they've been talking about doing.
James, the Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif recently talked to an American television network, and this is what he had to say. Let's watch this.
The last experience was not very optimistic and does not provide an optimistic perspective for a future agreement. So this is what I believe is happening to the international community. That is, people think twice before they talk to the United States because they know that what they agree today may not hold tomorrow.
James, does the Foreign Minister have a point there? Has U.S. diplomatic credibility been hurt?
No. I mean, the U.S. has signed 13 international agreements. Nobody had a problem with that. I mean, the Europeans themselves acknowledged they had problems with JPCOA, that it was an imperfect agreement. That's why they entered into a negotiation with the United States on trying to fix it. So nobody's in the illusion here that the JPCOA is an adequate deal to provide the concerns that everybody in Europe and the Middle East had. It was the deal that was agreed to, and the United States felt it was inadequate. And there was a lot of sympathy for the United States, and I think particularly in the region of the Middle East, a lot of concern that just resting on the laurels of JPCOA was not in the long run going to solve the problem. And
right.
So there are people that actually were kind of thankful that the president took that move, which was very controversial. He didn't have to do that. He could have just wrote it out.
Yeah, but I think the foreign minister's point there was that how can we make a deal with someone we don't trust?
We can go back to like Cain and Abel. That's been going on for international deals get made and throughout human history. So I'm not sure that's that's the nail in the coffin of global diplomacy.
Okay, Professor, go ahead.
It's not just that they cannot trust President Trump. The point is, how can we trust the next president? If he signs something with President Trump, so the next president can come and say that the deal is imperfect, thus I'm not going to abide by it. So that's the point. So that's why the credibility of the U.S. is under question, not just only by Iran, but rather by the international community, by the Europeans, by the Chinese, by the Russians, by everyone.
Okay.
Everyone asked President Trump, stay within the deal.
Yeah.
But he decided not to.
Right. Okay.
But just one key point there, I think that's why right now negotiations are going nowhere, because the Iranians aren't going to do anything until they know who they're going to be negotiating with after 2020. So I think we're in a stalemate as far as that goes. And honestly, if I was in Iran, that's what I would tell them to do, is wait and see if the guy's coming back.
Okay. Negar, just one other point, not unrelated to what we're talking about, and that is the U.S. State Department has suspended funding for an online project that was supposed to counter Iranian disinformation. But in fact, it targeted anyone who questioned the hardline position that the Trump administration has been taking on Iran. What's that about?
Yeah, so I did some research on this account, and it seems like the funding was from the Global Engagement Center, and the scope of the project was to counter propaganda and government misinformation put out by the Islamic Republic of Iran. But it seems like people who were running the project went beyond that into attacking American citizens who were perceived as, including myself, people who are opposed to war or opposed to sanctions, or basically opposed to the policy of maximum pressure by President Trump on Iran, which puts them in a very interesting situation right now, because now it seems like President Trump himself and even Secretary of State are shifting from that rhetoric and that policy. But eventually the State Department decided that they've been going outside of the scope of the project, and the funding was announced to be suspended, and we're still waiting to see what will happen after the suspension of the funding.
All right, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.